Welcome to this Gŵyl Crime Cymru Festival event, and welcome to Aberystwyth. Croeso i'r digwyddiad Gŵyl Crime Cymru Festival hwn, a chroeso I Aberystwyth. Aberystwyth, the cultural capital of Wales, home to Aberystwyth University and the National Library of Wales, once home to Welsh princes. The Biarritz of Wales is the jewel in the crown of Cardigan Bay's stunning coastline and home to hugely successful TV drama Hinterland. And now, the streets that have become familiar to fictional D.I. Mathias's many fans are getting ready to welcome celebrities from the worlds of crime fiction and crime drama. Because Aberystwyth is home to Wales's first ever international crime fiction event, Gŵyl Crime Cymru Festival. During the early May bank holiday weekend of 2022, Aber, as the town is affectionately known, will play host to a multitude of events that will offer something for every fan of crime fiction and drama. Internationally successful authors will entertain and meet readers in historic buildings. Pub quizzes will bring together authors and readers. Writing workshops, meet the agent sessions, and informal readings will help encourage and develop new writing talent. And in sparkling celebration of new Welsh talent, a champagne reception for Crime Cymru's first crime novel competition winners. This will be an Aber bank holiday weekend like no other. So, come for the crime fiction and take Cymru home in your hearts. Rydym yn edrych ymlaen yn fawr iawn at eich croesawu I Aberystwyth ac I Geredigion.
Hello, Prynhawn da pawb. Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Crime Cymru and our festival partners, Aberystwyth Town Council, welcome to panel number 10 of the Gŵyl Crime Cymru Festival online. I'm Kath Stansfield, a member of Crime Cymru, and I am delighted to welcome you to this event today. All our festival events are partnered with independent Welsh bookshops. The bookshop for our event is Browser's Bookshop in Porthmadog. If you're inspired to read any of the books you hear about this afternoon, please do consider buying from Browsers. And you can find a link, a click-through link, I should say, on our programme page under this event. Today, for event 10, we're discussing historical crime fiction, which is my absolute favourite genre of writing, marrying my two great loves of crime and historical fiction. And I'm lucky enough to be asking the questions today. I've got lots of questions to ask our guests, but we will have time for audience questions as well. So please do post in the comments on YouTube as we go along, and we'll come to those questions in due course. We'd love to hear from you. We are extremely lucky to be joined today by two brilliant and prize-winning writers of historical crime fiction. Both have been longlisted in this year's Crime Writers Association Dagger Awards, which, as I'm sure many of you in the audience today will know, are the preeminent awards for crime fiction in the UK. I'm going to introduce them one at a time, and they'll hopefully be able to turn their videos on and join us. So first, I'd like to welcome to the stage, Elly Griffiths. Hello, Elly. Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Elly is also writes under the name of Domenica De Rosa, which is her name you can see here. So in some ways, we've got two for the price of one, really, with this writer. And Elly is the author of the best-selling Dr. Ruth Galloway series, which features a forensic archaeologist and is set in Norfolk, as well as The Stranger Diaries and The Postscript Murders, two mysteries featuring Detective Harbinder Kaur. Elly also writes a Brighton-based mystery series set in the 1950s and 60s, the most recent of which is Now You See Them. Welcome, Elly.
Thank Thank you for having me. Very excited.
Oh, it's great to have you here. I feel like we've been planning this for so long and now we're really here. So it's quite amazing. It also gives me great pleasure to welcome our second writer today, Shona Mclean. Come in, Shona, if you'd like to turn on your camera. Hello.
Oh.
Hello. Shona writes 2 historical thriller series, one set in Scotland in the 1620s featuring Alexander Seton, and another set in London in the 1650s during Oliver Cromwell's rule, which stars the enigmatic spy Damien Seeker. And the most recent in the Seeker series is the 5th title, The House of Lamentations. Welcome to you both. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's great to have you here. For our very first ever Crime Cymru Festival. It's tremendously exciting. And just to kick things off, what I'm going to ask you each to do is to give us a 1-minute pitch of either your latest historical title or your historical series, whichever you prefer. I should have got some kind of cowbell so that we could have had an element of drama or a gong, but I've got none of those things, so no pressure there. But if you could just give us a quick taster, that would be great. And Elly, could we start with you?
Great. Starting now,
yes.
With no repetition or hesitation, probably loads of those things. Anyhow, Now You See Them is number 5 in what's now called the Brighton Mysteries series that starts in 1950 and is inspired by my granddad. Here he is, who was a music hall entertainer, who was a musical comedian. And it starts with a magician called Max Mephisto and a police officer called Edgar Stevens. But now in the 5th book, and the 6th book is out in September, it's called The Midnight Hour, it now focuses on 2 women private detectives. And in Now You See Them, there's the mysterious case of the disappearing women in true sinister magician style. So hope you enjoy it.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. That was super speedy. Great. And Shona, your turn, please.
Right, well, this is the House of Lamentations, and it is the 5th book in the Damien Seeker series, which is set mainly in the 1650s London of Oliver Cromwell, where Seeker is an intelligence handler and a kind of protection officer for Cromwell. So he's always trying to hunt down royalist spies and radical Republicans, and there always seems to be a murder crops up as well that he has to sort out. So in this book, as I say, it's the 5th and at the moment the last Damien Seeker book. He is sent to incognito to Bruges in Flanders to keep an eye on all the royalist exiles and plotters who are there. And any of you who've been to Bruges will know it's an absolutely fabulous city. And so basically Damien Seeker goes around this city and he's hunting down royalists. He's hunting down, well, there are nuns, and there's a brothel as well. But it's I was going to say it's a nice book, but you know, there are lots of murders and things like that. But if you feel like being taken back in time and just somewhere else entirely, you might quite like to try The House of Lamentations.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And that idea of going back in time, why we do that as writers, why we might enjoy it as readers, that's what we're thinking about today. But before we move backwards in time, we're going to think about place. Those of you who've watched other events in the festival so far will know that we're asking our guests to talk to us a little bit about Wales. We're a Welsh festival. I'm coming to you today from Cardiff, and next year we will be in Aberystwyth, which we're very excited about. So we're just going to touch on that today, and I'm going to take the opportunity to ask our guests something about Wales. And Elly, if I start with you, am I right that you are of Welsh stock?
That's right, yeah. So my real name, and I think it's appearing on the screen, is Domenica de Rosa, which doesn't sound super Welsh and does in fact sound made up, but is my real name because my dad was Italian. But when I wrote 4 books, as I think you mentioned, as Domenica de Rosa. But then when I wrote the first of the Ruth books, which is called The Crossing Places, my agent said to me, she said, this is crime, you need a crime name. And I immediately thought of my grandmother, which I think a lot of writers do maybe when they think of a pseudonym. And my grandmother was called Elly Griffiths, and she was Welsh. Very, very proudly Welsh, very much traced to ancestor in a straight line, really, back to Llewellyn ap Griffiths, you know, so really thought of herself as a royal Welsh stock. So I picked her name. I wanted to be Ellen Griffiths, But somehow when the books came out, I saw that I'd become Elly. And I did think to ask my editor about that once. And in fact, Shona and I have the same wonderful editor, Jane Wood. And I remember Jane saying to me, she said, I think it just looked a bit tidier. Which actually, if you see the books, the Elly does fit in very neatly there between the G and the F. So I became Elly Griffiths because it was tidier, but it's very much my grandmother, Elly Griffiths, was Welsh, and I, half Welsh, half Italian, should be able to sing, but can't.
Oh, well, you'll be pleased to know we're not going to be singing today. So we'll save that for Aberystwyth. We'll try some singing.
Absolutely. I'll learn by then.
Great. Okay. That's amazing that your name was sort of changed for you on the books.
It's probably, I'm sure there was more consultation than I'm saying, but initially her name was Ellen and I wanted to be Ellen Griffiths, but it's the Griffiths that's the important bit, definitely.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I just wanted to ask you a little bit, just thinking about it, now you see them, the most recent title in your Brighton Mysteries is that you've got a character, he's a minor character, but he is very important in the plot, called Howell Davis. And we learned from the story that he lives in Maesteg in the South West Valleys. And I wondered if that was a link somehow to your grandmother's family, or where does Maesteg fit in?
I had a boyfriend from Maesteg.
Oh. Okay.
When I was at university.
Right.
And that's probably all I'm going to say about him.
Okay.
But that's why the place came in, definitely.
Okay. It's funny how these things are kind of ghosts from our own past sometimes.
Well, he was a doctor, and I have to say, again, not going to say too much, but doctors never come over very well in my book. Something that I think I share with Agatha Christie. She seemed to be very suspicious of doctors. And again, not saying anything against this boyfriend who is a lovely person and I'm sure. But doctors never come over very well in my books.
Interesting. Very interesting. Thank you for that. And Shona, I know that you have yet to make it to Wales. Mm-hmm. But we hope that with our festival in Aberystwyth next year, we can remedy that, so it should be lovely. But I know that there's an important Welsh element in your Seeker series, and it really comes to the fore in the second book, The Black Friar. And I wondered if you just wanted to tell us a little bit about what made you draw on kind of the Welsh language, Welsh characters, but also to make Seeker's mother Welsh, which I thought was really interesting.
Well, for me, Damien Seeker's a bit of an outsider. He operates mainly in London, but he's a Yorkshireman. I wanted him to be an outsider to London and not be a sort of London type, if you know what I mean. And I found when I was writing the first book that the Welsh seemed to be particularly troublesome. And and Damien Seeker mutters a lot, and he's quite grumpy. And I like the fact that there were lots of Welsh royalists he had to try and deal with in the first book, and so it gave him a lot to sort of mutter and be grumpy about. He went to Oxford and he had to have a raid on Jesus College in Oxford, which was a hotbed of Welsh royalism. So that kind of got the Welsh thing at the back of my mind. And then in the second book, I had an old school teacher who was sort of slipping into senility, this old schoolmaster. And for some reason, I made him Welsh. But he had seen something and understood something that was a sort of major clue in the book. And he had taken to muttering about it. And I thought, well, how can Damien Seeker know what he's talking about? I thought, his mother was Welsh, so he can speak Welsh. So that's why Damien Seeker's mother is Welsh. And I just realised today when I was looking back through things that there are hints, particularly in the first book, you could probably work out one of the characters if you speak Welsh, because I chose his name. I kind of translated it with help, I have to say. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. So that's some good a detective project for our Welsh-speaking audience who are coming to your work for the first time. And it's interesting that Elly was talking there about names and author names, and because you write under S.G. MacLean now. That's right, isn't it?
Yeah. I was initially published as Shona Mclean, but one day the same editor who found Elly more tidy than Ellen, she called me and she told me that somebody at the publishing house felt that my name Shona was too soft and feminine, and that he wouldn't buy a book by somebody called Shona. So it was suggested that I change to my initials, and I did. And I have to say, the book that the initials were changed on sold much more in paperback than the previous two had sold. So I don't know if there was something in it or not. So I'm now SG.
And I have to say that I have a Shona Mclean in my books.
Yes. I was going to ask you, is that, I thought, I was so interested to see that. Tell us about that.
It was written before I knew Shona, because in fact we met at Harrogate Crime Festival for the first time, and my book had just come out, and I think you were already SG then, Shona. But I do wonder if somewhere I had heard the name, if Jane had said, I've got this other lovely writer, you know, it might have. I can't acquit myself of the fact that the stunningly beautiful Shona in my books, you know, may have a look.
She has a much more exciting and scandalous life than I do.
I love the fact that, Elly, that
quite
you think
an exciting life, yeah.
that you think you must have heard the name, because otherwise it's very spooky if you hadn't heard the name.
It really is, but I have a bit of you know, I have a bit of a record with names, because in the Nighthawks, which is the most recent Ruth book, which is Ruth 13, there's a character in it called Neil Topham, and I thought that's a good name. And then when the book came out, quite a lot of people wrote to me saying, is there a link between Neil Topham in the fourth book, A Room Full of Bones? And of course there isn't. It's just that I thought that name sounds good, and I wrote it down. So anyone who's got a Neil Topham Nighthawks, it's a collector's item because it's been changed for the paperback. But it was just that I thought, oh, that sounds a good name. Obviously,
Wow.
I've thought that before. So you know, names are very interesting, aren't they? They are very interesting. You're not quite sure where they come from, but they must come from somewhere.
And also, if we're writing a series with ongoing characters, as we all do, we're a real hostage to those early decisions that we make about characters. And, you know, if we don't kill them off, if they're recurring, then, you know, actually we're often stuck with those names. And we have to remember them, which is a real challenge. And I think maybe that's a good point to turn to historical fiction more generally, which is what we're here to think about today. And I'm always really interested to ask writers what draws them to the period in which they set their books, especially with series books, because you end up spending a long time in that particular period. And I'd be interested to just hear how you came to write about your period. So Shona, if we start with you, obviously your two series moved between the early 1600s and then sort of mid 1600s. How did you start writing about that time period?
Well, I'd done a PhD in 17th century Scottish history, and it was mainly on education and charity. But it meant I spent literally years of my life in archives reading 17th century manuscript sources, to the extent that the characters in them became so real to me that I genuinely felt more comfortable in the 17th century than I did in the 20th, 21st. And the part of Scotland I lived in at the time, there were lots, I lived in the town of Banff, there were lots of remnants of the 16th, 17th century. And so I started wondering about the people who used to live there. And all these characters I'd been reading about in the archives came back into my head, and I basically fictionalized a story. And then when it came to moving to London, I had to move it on to the 1650s, because what really fascinated me about London was the arrival of the first coffee shop in London in the 1650s. So to my horror, I had to move on to the Cromwellian period, and that meant an awful lot more work. But so that's what got me into the 17th century.
That's fantastic. It's interesting, that idea of the built environment, that there were remnants of that period where you were living, that you could see signs of it that can be quite magical, I think, when you're thinking about stories, to actually be able to see it in front of you and see how the light hits it at a certain time, and where doorways were. I often feel quite amazed by my reaction to chimneys and chimney breasts. I mean, you sound a bit, I feel I sound insane saying that, but it's sometimes to see a hearth where somebody, which would have been a big part of somebody's life, is incredibly powerful. Elly, could you talk to us about what drew you to the 50s and 60s?
Yes, of course. And just to totally agree with what you said about chimneys and looking up and seeing it. And I do think Shona just conjures, those periods just amazingly in her books. It's really incredible. And you too, Catherine, in The Mermaid's Call. I mean, just fantastic. I'm really in awe of people who do proper history. As I was saying, the Brighton Mysteries were kind of inspired by my granddad, it was called Dennis Laws, and he was married to Elly Griffiths for a while. So he's called Dennis Laws, and he was a music hall comedian, famous between the wars, really. He fought in the First World War, and afterwards, after everything he'd seen, he said to my mum, after everything I've seen in the war, there was only one job I could do, and that's to become a comedian. And that's what he did. And he had this kind of really sort of roving life. He didn't have a home. He just moved around every week in a different theatre. So he'd be in Glasgow, he'd be in Manchester, he'd been in Bournemouth, traveling the country. And the really unusual thing was that he did that with my mum with him. So he was a single parent, and he brought my mum up on his own, which was really unusual for the times. It was really close to my granddad. And when he died, he left me his playbills. And it was really the playbills, oh my goodness, the names on them. There are things like Lou Lenny and her unrideable mule. I mean, what's all that about? Was there a real mule? And big letters on one of them. So he must have been quite famous at top of the bill. Ray Deeney, the gay deceiver. No idea who he was. And so I just wanted to write about these people. I wanted to write about Variety, music hall. But I decided to set them in the 50s because that was the beginning of the end of Variety, because TV was coming in. And one of the books, The Blood Card, is set during 1953 during the coronation. And a lot of people got a TV for the coronation. So those days of sort of roving Variety were dying. And I think people thought they were dying for good. I think they'd be very surprised to see Britain's Got Talent and really a sort of rebirth of Variety a little bit. So it was really that period I wanted to sort of focus in on, because it was the end of those days. And that those old comedians, those old ventriloquists and magicians whose job were sawing people in half, what were they going to do now? And so in the most recent book, which is coming out in September, right up to 1965, I'm changing a lot of women. They're not changing as much as you'd think. So it's a really interesting period for me, really. It's a sort of it's definitely in living memory, and there's lots of, very lucky really, as opposed to Shona had to do an actual PhD to research her books, and I just get to look in archives, so lucky me.
Well, that's wonderful to know. And I'm interested in this question of the sort of contemporary resonance of historical fiction, and you've touched on that there, Elly, thinking about the role of women and the changing position of women. And I think that historical fiction generally, it's amazing how nothing really goes away. We're still beaten over the head with this idea that it's a cop-out somehow to write about the past, and crime fiction particularly, to write about crime set in the past, that somehow we're just avoiding the tough things. We're not talking about gritty contemporary issues. We're kind of dodging things somehow. And I'd be interested to know kind of your thoughts on that, and also how you see your historical crime novels as speaking to issues of the present day. Do you see that? Do you see them as a kind of comment on contemporary issues? And if so, are you aware of that when you start out? Do you think, right, this is going to be this kind of issue book? Or actually, is it something that's a bit more fluid, that develops more organically? Shona, do you want to just unpick that mess of questions I've just launched at you there?
I find I never set out to comment on the present day. I always try to set myself in the time that I'm writing in, and to try and write from the viewpoint of my characters. For instance, my characters don't know that the Stuarts are coming back. They don't know there's going to be a restoration. So I try to operate them as much in their world as I can. And not to make a comment on our society. But what I find is that things repeat themselves all the time. in history, and particularly with something like, well, in Scotland we refer to it as the Wars of the Three Kingdoms rather than the English Civil War, because of course the whole of the British Isles were caught up in these wars. But basically, time and again over history, you get a movement for greater, driven by the desire for greater liberty, which will bring a character, a government, and then often one character to power, who, in order to hold on to power, restricts liberties more than they had been in the first place, and we see this again and again in revolutions. So, but also I find sometimes you're writing things and you think, gosh, this is happening just now, because when I was writing The House of Lamentations, there was a section at the beginning of it where two characters are complaining about Cromwell having closed down Parliament. And I was writing that. I wrote that about 4 or 5 days before Boris Johnson closed it, which I think we've even forgotten that happened.
Yeah.
So so you get across things like this. But one of my books in my Alexander Seton series is set in 17th century Ulster, and I really didn't want that to be seen as a comment on present day Ulster. So it's quite difficult, but sometimes things do crop up.
Do you feel that there's a tendency for readers to just kind of scaffold your book or historical fiction generally, that they will read through the lens of whatever is happening, and that in some ways we as writers we can't necessarily control that? Do you find that in terms of when people give you kind of feedback on your stories and let you know how they sort of read them?
Yeah, I do. Occasionally somebody will say that to me, and that's fine, as long as they know that I didn't set that out. But I think a book is a kind of organic thing. It doesn't just belong to the person who writes it. The reader participates in the process, and the book means and says something to them that the writer might not have intended, but it's perfectly valid.
Yeah, and in the hope that we'll all be read in 100 years' time, who knows what lens will be read through, and that's both terrifying and exciting. Elly, I wonder about what your thoughts are on that kind of the contemporaneousness of historical fiction, and if you're aware of that, how you feel about it.
It's very interesting, isn't it? And I do think it is interesting. Like Shona, I suppose that's not where I start. There's usually some sort of place or some sort of event that sort of sparks the books, but you can't get away from that feeling of that things are sort of happening again. But then again, I think you have to watch looking at the past with a modern day eyes, because of course in the 50s they didn't know they were in the quaint old 50s, black and white TV. They thought they were in glorious color, and they talked about themselves as the new Elizabethans in 1953. So it's that, and also the 60s. I've had if you set a series in Brighton, you have to have the mods and rockers, and that they appear in Now You See Them, the big sort of battle between mods and rockers. But really the 60s didn't start to swing that early. That's 1964, and big fan of William Shaw's series set in the 60s. And he said, I remember hearing him talk, and he was saying the 60s didn't start in Devon, which is where he was brought up and where the book's partly set, until like 1969, So you have to be sort of aware of that, don't you, and looking at it. But yes, so many things do come to you when you're writing these books. For example, as I was saying, now in the series that there are women characters coming to the fore, and one of them is a woman police officer, and women weren't allowed to drive police cars until the 70s, and those sort of things do bring you up, and other homosexuality was still illegal in 1965. I mean, it's shocking to think that, but that was the case. So I think it is interesting the way you look at the past, and the way these as Shona says, things do kind of go in circles, don't they? And you kind of wish maybe some politicians studied history a bit harder, maybe.
Oh yes. yes, we could, but hope, especially those politicians who tend to write popular histories. They seem to churn them out. I won't mention any names, but some seem to have lots of time to write another popular history of of Churchill, and you think, gosh, are you reading enough of it yourself? I definitely feel that. And I think that question about trying to think of ourselves back into the mindset of characters who don't know what's coming, of a period who don't know what's coming, is a real challenge for us as writers. And I think Shona, that point about that, that in the 1650s, people didn't know the Stuarts were coming back, and now to us that seems like that's the inevitable bookend of that period. And but actually to not know that was happening is quite radical, actually. And I think that's one of the challenges of writing historical fiction, and brings me to my next point, which is that I often think if you're writing historical crime, we've got two jobs to do. We have to work really hard. We have to write, we have to do our research, we have to convey the period in a convincing way, we have to get into the mindset of those characters who don't know what's coming, and we have to deliver a good crime plot. And that's quite a tall order, actually. And in fact, in a panel earlier in the week, Mary Hannah said she felt that people who wrote historical novels should be paid twice as much as people who didn't, because we have to do twice as much work. And I obviously agree with that, definitely. But I wanted to ask each of you if you feel that as a burden or not, that the kind of twin demands of writing historical crime. How is that? Do they kind of work together well for you, or do you see it as more challenging? And Shona, can we start with you on that? How do you manage the kind of twin demands of the genre?
I do find it challenging, but there's no way around it, really. I do, I try to do as much reading as possible before I start the writing, but I was making up a list yesterday of what I've still got to read for the book that I'm redrafting at the moment, that's due in 2 months, because you never feel you've read enough, you never feel you've done enough. So I do, and sometimes you think it is difficult. You've got to convey this history, and you know that some of the people who are buying your book are going to be absolute experts, and what you're writing about is going to mean it. It's what they really care about. So you've got to get that right. That you've got to get a fictional story in there. And one of my favorite complaints about one of my books was an online reviewer who complained about the book The Bear Pit, which was set against the historical background of 4 failed assassination attempts on Oliver Cromwell. And that was historical, and I explained in a note at the end that was historically accurate, the four assassination attempts. But my fictional story involved the murder of a man who was eaten by a bear. And this reviewer complained about the failed assassination attempts. He perfectly accepted the bear side of it, but complained that the historical bit was just ridiculous. And so sometimes there's only so much you can do. But yeah, I do find it a challenge, yes.
That's such an interesting point, when you're confronted with something that's in a historical record that seems unbelievable. I mean, I sometimes find myself thinking, what will my agent say when I say, no, this really happened, and will that be too ridiculous? It's a real sort of quirk of writing in this genre, I think. Elly, how do you find sort of balancing these two? Because obviously you write a contemporary set crime series too, with which you have different research needs, the archaeology obviously, but not necessarily the historical side. So I wonder how you see the challenge of historical crime.
To me, honestly, it's an absolute holiday. I have to say, it's an absolute holiday to switch to the historical crime. And also I write a children's series called A Girl Called Justice that's set in the 1930s. And they are I give myself an hour of that as a treat at the end of the day to relax. So I think it's just because, God bless the 1950s, no DNA testing, no mobile phones, no internet. I mean, if you're any sort of writer, you have to work those into your modern crime fiction, and you can make them super spooky. At the moment, the Ruth book I'm writing on the moment is actually set in lockdown, and I'm sort of bringing in the spookiness of those black screens on a Zoom session where you never see someone's face, you never know who's there. You can bring those things in, but I have to say it's always a treat to me to be back in the 1950s or 60s or 30s without those things, where people can say, what happened to the great Diablo? Oh, I don't know. Whereas nowadays it would be, Google him, you idiot. Oh, I don't know. I wrote him a letter, care of his agent, about 10 years ago, but I don't know what happened to him. And those sort of things are fantastic. And then walking to places. And by the way, Shona, I think your bear, person who complained about the bear, is an example of rule 450 of crime writing, which is that people always complain about stuff with animals.
Yes.
Yes, it's probably just an extension of that. Because, for example, a cat dies very sadly in the first Ruth book. And I don't want to show off, but I've killed a lot of humans, but people still write and complain about the cat, so maybe that's the bear thing. But yes, I have to say, for me, it is a bit of a holiday. Obviously, there is research, but the Ruth books have the archaeological research, and then you have to do the police procedure research, and all the forensic research, and that's massive. Though I'm very looking forward to coming to Aberystwyth and seeing some Mesolithic stuff, which I believe is there. So yes. I can't wait to see all that. So yes, for me, I have to say, bit of a relaxation.
That's really interesting. And I think the point about technology and mobile phones in plotting crime fiction is really considerable, actually. And as soon as you decide to set a crime story mass sort of telecommunication, it's like a line in the sand. It's almost like the difference between the steam revolution, if you're either side of that line in terms of history. And I mean, I thought that really powerfully, Elly, just to say, now you see them. It's a big thing about someone needing to make a phone call, and where is the nearest phone, and the absolute panic where something terrible has happened and you need to call the police, but you don't have a phone in your house. Where is the nearest phone? And that makes a massive difference to plotting, but also to characters as well, in terms of how quickly they can react, what happens to them, their sense of safety. But of course, that also goes completely against what I said before about sticking in a character's world. If you don't know about mobile phones existing, then you won't know what you're missing, will you? So yeah.
I think there's also anecdotally quite a lot of crime fiction that's set just before mobile phones, like sort of in the 90s, sort of a new sort of golden age. But yes, you're absolutely right. A lot of people didn't have a phone, and not being able to. And of course, if you're writing in the present day, you have to do something about that mobile phone. And there is a limit to the number of times you can say, oh, she wasn't getting any reception. Yeah. And the Ruth books are set in Norfolk, where reception is quite bad, but you can't keep saying that. So she has to lose it, or there's the modern day panic of being almost out of charge. You can do a lot with that, but it's quite nice to be without it, I have to say.
Yes, I recently read a sort of legal thriller, Without Prejudice, by Nicola Williams, which was originally published in the 90s and has been reissued as part of the Penguin Writing Black Britain series. And it was such a relief to read a thriller that was before mobile phones. Everyone left each other handwritten notes, and put them in trays, and it created all sorts of interesting delays. I just should say, I hope you can't hear the rain. It's absolutely pouring in Cardiff. And I will probably be talking louder because it's really loud on my skylight. So apologies if I start shouting. I'm interested to ask you a bit more detail about your crime plot specifically, and whether or not the crime elements that you've written about in your historical series, if those are based on real things. So Shona, you mentioned there the assassination attempts on Oliver Cromwell, but in terms of, for instance, the bear attack, is that based on something that you actually discovered?
Only in the sense that when I decide, on the next book, I usually move it on a year from the previous one, roughly. And I have a look at all the things that happened in that year. And the year of the bear pit set in, I think, I can't remember, was it 1655? I'm not sure. But that year, the Cromwellian Protectorate had ordered all the bears in Bankside to be shot. And I thought, I wonder what would have happened. Imagine if one wasn't shot. I think they kept a couple of cubs or something, but I thought, imagine if one wasn't shot, if somebody got hold of one. And so that's what set that off. So there'll be little things like that. It's I look at what happened that year, and then I start thinking, oh, that's interesting, but then I manipulate it quite a lot. Yeah.
Okay, so you're drawing from the historical record for the sort of composty elements of the plot, it sounds like.
Yes.
And then kind of activating it. That's great. And Elly, how about you in terms of the crime elements of your historical writing? Is that drawn from real events? Is that important to you?
I don't think any of the actual murders are based on anything real, but the character of Max Mephisto, who is the magician in the books, is actually influenced by a real person called Jasper MacLean, who wasn't that a great name? Jasper, talk about names, Jasper MacLean, such a great name. And he was a very famous magician between the wars. In fact, I remember doing an event at Eastbourne and saying to the audience, has anyone heard of Jasper MacLean? And the woman at the front said, oh yes, he was my uncle. And I said, and he was lovely. But when he might have been lovely, he probably was lovely. But what the interesting thing about him was during the Second World War, he was asked by Churchill to set up a group of magicians to work in the war effort and to use stage magic in the war effort, things like sleight of hand or camouflage. And they were called the Magic Gang, and that actually was true. And they did things like they created dummy tanks and dummy soldiers. That they used light. They were meant to have made the Suez Canal disappear through use of light. So that is true, and that was something that runs through the book. That whole idea of using deception, and it was something that Boris Johnson's favourite person, Churchill, was actually quite interested in. How to use sort of sleight of hand and deception and camouflage. So that does run through the books, and that does have a real. So the Magic Gang were actually real.
That's wonderful. It's the magic element that's real. I think that's a
it's as real as magic can be.
Yeah, somehow a comment on historical crime fiction to me. Somehow it's the magic that's real. I'm aware of time, so before we come to audience questions, I wanted to ask you both, in terms of writing historical crime specifically, do you have any kind of advice or words of wisdom for any writers who might be starting out in this genre or thinking about it? Anything that you might consider as like a helpful first step? Shona, I don't know if you've got anything you might add to that.
All I would say is that don't get overwhelmed at trying to prove you know your stuff historically. You need to write with the confidence. You do need to know your stuff, but you have tried to just transmit that without showing all the evidence. Don't let it hold up the story. Write with confidence, and your readers will accept that you know what you're talking about.
That's great, thank you. And Elly, what would your advice be?
I once heard, in fact, it was William Shaw talking about C.J. Sampson. I'm a huge fan of him as a historical writer. And he said that C.J. Sampson spent 3 weeks researching sheep for Tombland. And they actually only come into it for 2 minutes. You see some sheep. But my goodness, they're well-researched sheep. So it does link to what Shona was saying, which is that don't feel you have to wear all your research on the outside, even if you end up only writing 2 lines about sheep. The fact that you've researched them will show, and they will be fantastic sheep.
Yeah, fantastic sheep. That's excellent.
Start with the sheep.
Start with the sheep. Yes, brilliant. Well, just because I'm keeping an eye on time, I think we will turn to audience questions now. And while we've been talking, Crime Cymru's very own Amy Williams has been keeping an eye on the questions coming in on the YouTube chat. So now, as if by magic, part of a theme, here is Amy. Welcome, Amy. Thank you so much for being here. So she's going to now direct some of the questions from the chat. So Amy, I will just hand over to you.
And we have loads and loads of questions, and they're still coming in as I'm watching now. So I'll start off with the first one, which is from Mavanwi, who would like to know, how difficult is it to accurately reflect the thought processes of people that have such different values to those of modern readers? Should we start with you, Elly?
What a great question. Hi. And it is difficult. And I think it's a balancing act that a lot of crime writers, well, any historical writer has to have. It's to sometimes reflect those values which we really don't show, so sort of to show we don't show them, but also show that they existed, and it is quite hard. The only thing I would say is the other trap not to fall into is to assume that everyone had these values. And in fact, talking about Shard Lake in C.J. Sanderson's book, he's quite a modern man, you know, and he has sort of quite modern attitudes, and I don't think that's wrong. So Edgar Stevens in Stevens and Mephisto books, he has, I think, what we would think of as quite liberal attitudes, but there were people in the 50s with those attitudes. My grandfather was definitely one of them. So I would say it is quite difficult, but then I think it is a trap to suddenly make all your characters horrifically sort of racist and homophobic and awful, because they weren't all like that.
Brilliant. And what about you, Shona?
Yeah, I would basically go along with that. I mean, I try to read first-person accounts of the period that I'm writing about, and actually they're not generally riddled. They're not utterly riddled with racism, sexism, things like that. Although there will be, you know, I love Pepys, but I really wouldn't have wanted to be married to him. But yeah, I think you need to show to a certain extent that some people had these attitudes, and you have to try not to make your sympathetic characters be arguing for these attitudes, but sometimes you have to show that they have them just like everybody else, and it is a difficult balancing act, because you don't want to put your readers off, and you don't want to give false pictures of your characters, so it is quite difficult.
I've always thought that Damien would get on well with Nelson, actually, Shona. Even though you would have the Yorkshire-Lancashire thing, but they would get on, I think.
They would completely get on. And they both have these romantic pickles they've got themselves into as well, haven't they? Yes.
So that almost leads me into the next question, really, which comes from Alice. And she would like to know, do you ever get people telling you things like, well, that wouldn't have happened in those days, even when you're writing about things that did actually happen? Shona?
Yes, the one time that it happened to me was I was talking to a local book group where I used to live and where my first book was set. And my first book's called The Redemption of Alexander Seton, and it's all, you know, there's all sorts of religious pressures on people. And at 17th century Scotland, the church records are they're utterly full of complaints about fornication. And so I've got somebody who was going to be a minister but was disgraced because it was found out that he'd, you know, been in a relationship and married with this young woman. And somebody at the book group said, well, that just wouldn't have happened. They wouldn't have been like that because they were very religious at the time, you know, and there was nothing I could say to persuade her that, no, this happened all the time. So yes, you do get it. I you know, also I got a letter once about having used the wrong type of weapon about 10 years before it would have been used. So you get that kind of, which is perfectly legitimate.
Yes, it's human nature doesn't change, really, does it? Yeah, sometimes. I mean, actually, going back to our discussion earlier on, Catherine saying, oh, it's the magic that's real. Sometimes people have queried that whole backstory, you know, about the magic men and the war. And actually, that's the bit that's genuinely true, you know. And people do, I think, find that quite hard to believe that happened, really. Also, with the Ruth books, occasionally, there's nothing in the archaeology that's not true. So, and none of the forensic archaeology. So there are things like, you know, if you see nettles in your garden, you could have a dead body. That's actually true. So people do sometimes query those things, and maybe not the things that I've just liberally made up. So they tend to believe in those bits.
We have a question from Phil, who is watching all the way from Italy right now. And he would like to know, he says, the big question for historical novelists has to be, when do you decide when you've done enough research? Elly?
Buongiorno, Filippo. It's a really interesting question, because research is a lot of fun. And I teach creative writing, and my students love the research. We all do. But there is a point where you just have to stop and start writing. You know, it is known when that point is. So I think the thing is, I know both Shona and I, we have the same editor, and so we do tend to stick to our deadlines. So when you have a deadline, you know, and I'm sure it's Catherine's the same with you, when you know you have to start writing, you have to start writing. And I think it's if you just keep going with the research, it would last forever and it would be wonderful. But there is a point where you have to just stop and start writing. And I would say, don't set a date and start writing that date, even if you haven't done all your research. And even if that means when you get to a bit that you don't know, just put a big question mark in the margin and keep going, because it's just so easy to stop and say, I really can't write that bit until I find out more about Tudor sheep. You know, just put a question mark and come back to the sheep. So that's what I was saying. Research could last forever, but I would say set yourself a date and start writing then.
Shona?
Yeah, I mean, it's the deadline that does it for me as well, because otherwise I simply would just keep researching and researching. But you know, I've got vast amounts of reading I've done for tiny little things, and I think basically what you need to do before you start writing is get the basics, and then as Elly says, you write your story and you'll have question marks, and in your redraft, by the time you're doing your redraft, you're filling in these question marks. But yes, it's a deadline that makes me start writing, because otherwise you wouldn't. There's always something else, and you live in fear of somebody pointing out, but you haven't got this quite right. Yeah.
Shona, have you ever done that, like put a question mark and guessed, and then gone back and your guess has been right?
No, I don't think so. I haven't guessed. If I go back and it doesn't fit, I just take that out of the story altogether. No.
So our next question comes from Carol, and she would like to know what attracted you to the era that you write about. Should we start with you, Shona?
Well, as I say, I'd done quite a lot of research in the 17th century anyway, but what made me want to write fiction in it was a 17th century in Scotland. The records are written very much in the voice of the people, and this is happening in England as well, particularly at the time of the civil wars. You hear the voice of the man and woman in the street, which to me has a great deal more appeal than you know, kings and queens, which is why I don't write about kings and queens. You get a real feel of what it was like for people from their voice, and it's really in the 17th century, I think that comes to the fore.
Elly?
Yeah, I think in some ways it was sort of that is a similar thing with me. It really was that I was interested in musical and variety because of my grandfather being on the stage and being a musical entertainer. But it really was those playbills and those names on them, as I was saying, Lou Laney and her Unrideable Mule, and the Great Radini, and Lavander's Feats with the Feet, and it is a vanished world. But also in some similar way to what Shona was saying, that this was real people. This was really their lives, wasn't it? You would go to the theatre and you'd see these people, and I've always been fascinated. I'm you know, I loved acting at school and university, and I've always been fascinated by the difference between the front of theatres, which are always sort of full of gold and velvet and amazing, and then the backstage, which is always kind of grim and horrible and usually sort of smells of mold, you know. So I wanted to kind of was that sort of juxtaposition between the two, and I felt it was particularly strong in the 50s, you know, and it was the end of variety, the end of musical. So there was a slight melancholy that went along with that really interested me. And of course, I wasn't sure that the series would go on as long as it did, but now I'm in the 1960s. So it's really less melancholy, and it's a kind of a start of a new sort of entertainment. So that really interests me as well.
Fantastic. We have a question from Sarah, and this one's for Shona. And she says, being Scottish, do you partake in a wee dram of whiskey? And if so, have you tried any Welsh whiskey?
Well, I I do partake in a wee dram. My husband and I decided that in lockdown we'd have one evening a week where we had a sort of date night where we play chess, which well, I've won twice, but the rest of the time he's won. And we try a whiskey and we'll read about it and things like that and see what, he knows more about whiskey than I do. So I do have a dram. And I didn't even know there was Welsh whiskey. So I'm very interested to hear about this.
Yes.
Yeah, it's called Penderyn whiskey.
Okay.
And it seems to be a very firm favourite with I mean, we've chatted about whiskey with several of our
I know,
panelists.
that's what I was
a bit of a running theme. But it seems to be very popular with those that have tried it. So maybe one to try for the future.
Oh, well, if I'm able to come there next year, which I really want to do, I'm definitely going to buy a bottle of it. Definitely.
Brilliant. Yeah. And now we have a question for you, Elly, and this again is from Alice, and she says that your books are set within living memory. Are you sometimes tripped up when you find yourself including details which you assumed were freely available at the time, but which then you later discover were not?
Oh, that's really interesting. Yes, I think when things are in living memory, there are quite a few of those moments where you sort of trip up against something and you think, oh, okay. And one of them was the one that I mentioned earlier, that I had assumed I was going to have my WPC, as they were called then, sort of driving the police car. Hadn't realized that was not allowed until the 70s, So there are those moments where and I think maybe it shocks you a bit more when you're when it's in living memory, obviously I don't remember the 50s, but it's not that long ago, really. I was born in the 60s, I have to say, so I do remember them a bit. So although they weren't terribly swinging in our household. So yes, there are definitely those things that you do come up across, and it is almost more shocking because it is within living memory, and because it's people are around who remember those days. So yes, there are definitely a few things like that. Yeah, it makes it very interesting, I think.
Great. We have a question from Anne for Shona, and she asks, were you inspired by or mentored by your uncle?
I was inspired by him. My uncle, Alistair MacLean of HMS Ulysses and things like that, was my dad's brother. He died when I was only 20. So he died long before I wrote, but he did used to speak to me sometimes about writing and try and encourage me about writing. I never showed him anything I'd written, but in the sense that I had this belief that you could do it with my kind of background, that it was okay, that you could do that. Somebody with my background could be a writer. In the other sense, in terms of what I write, when I was writing my first book, my dad and all his brothers were gone by this time. But I remember thinking, I hoped it was the kind of thing they would have enjoyed, a bit of adventure, a bit of daring do, historical, and possibly more of that I like writing adventure stories and entertainment, I'd say. He inspired me in that way. Yeah.
Lovely. We have another question from Thorn, who would like to know, what's more important, getting the historical facts right or getting into the minds of the period?
That's such a good question. Of course, ideally you should do both, but I do think, for me, it does all come down to character. It does all come down to you having a likable, not even likable necessarily, but a relatable character. So somebody that your readers can relate to, because to be honest, tension and suspense in a crime novel comes from caring what happens to that character. You care about Damien, grumpy though he is, you do care about him, and you care about Anna in Catherine's books, Anna and Shelley. You really want to know what happens to them, and so that's where that comes from, I think. So if you don't have that, identity with a character, then your books will just be historical facts. And maybe a very clever plot, could be the cleverest plot in the world. So I would say probably for me, the most important thing is believing in that person and in that voice.
Thank you. And Shona?
Yeah, I do think character is the most important thing, and trying to get their voice to be as authentic as possible. I think, you know, you try, I think we all try to get the history right and not to have anything in that we know is wrong. But I do always emphasize that I see myself as writing an entertainment for people. And that if they really want to get into the historical nitty-gritty, there's a lot of good non-fiction history out there, and there's a place for both of us. But I think you do, if you're writing historical novels, you do have an obligation to try and get it as right as you can. Yeah.
Brilliant. And I think we have time for one last question. And this one comes from Phil from Venice again. And he would like to know, what writer, past or present, would you like to have a conversation with, and why? Should we start with you, Elly?
My cat is just waking up. I thought he was going to come over, but he's gone back to sleep again. Oh, great question, Phil. I wish I was there in Venice. How lovely. I would say probably Wilkie Collins. I'm a huge fan of Wilkie Collins's writing. He's been a big influence on me, particularly the way he writes about landscape. So I would love to have a chat with him. Also, he was a pretty interesting guy and a real example, actually, of those kind of modern. If you read No Name, his idea about women were actually quite modern. So, and he was a court reporter like Dickens, so he'd have a lot of good stories. So Wilkie Collins, I would say.
Brilliant. Shona?
Well, I would say this chap here, Robert Louis Stevenson. I love Robert Louis Stevenson. I love his books. I think The Master of Ballantrae is absolutely, it's more influential really than Jekyll and Hyde. And if there was recently a book come out called Friendship and Letters, which is the letters between him and J.M. Barrie, and it's absolutely fabulous. If you weren't in love with Robert Louis Stevenson before you read this, you would be afterwards. So yes, it's him.
I haven't read much of him, and you've inspired me to do so.
Good.
Well, thank you both very much. I think that's all the kind of time we have for questions. So I'm going to pass back over now to Kath, who's going to close the session out.
Great. Thank you so much, Amy. The cats are stirring. My cat is on my lap, so I'm leaning forward to talk into my mic. So that's obviously a sign that we've come to the end of our time. The cat clock is ticking. It just remains for me to thank our two guests, Elly Griffiths and Shona Mclean, for joining us today and for just sharing their thoughts and their humour and their time with us. Thank you both so much. Diolch yn fawr iawn. So on behalf of the festival, I'd like to thank you, and also to our audience at home, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to Amy Williams, my right-hand woman, and also to Sam Ebenezer of Hacker Entertainment, who you can't see, but is doing all the hard graft behind the scenes for the tech support. We're very grateful. So on behalf of the Gŵyl Cymru Festival Online, diolch yn fawr iawn, thank you very much. I wish you all a wonderful weekend, and I look forward to seeing you in Aberystwyth next year. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.